think it's fair to say that 2024 has been a pretty amazing year for the Mac. We've seen refreshes in almost every product category. We've even seen an entire product redesign in the form of the brand new M4 Mac Mini. But if you're buying a new Mac computer right now at the end of 2024, the product lineup is arguably the most confusing it's ever been. So in this video, I'm going to break down the entire Mac lineup as it is right now and try to help you decide which Mac is right for you. We're then going to look at each product, spec out a few configurations, and look to make sure that you're getting bang for your buck without spending money on things that you don't need. Okay, let's get into it. So the first thing to think about when buying a Mac is whether you want a laptop or a desktop. You probably already know the answer to this before even clicking on this video, but it's still really important to get it right. Macs are expensive, and if you pick the wrong one, you will regret it later. The main difference between the two is portability. A laptop is obviously much more portable than a desktop. You can throw it in a bag, open it up anywhere and use it as long as you've got enough battery and ideally an internet connection. A desktop though is meant to stay put, although interestingly the new M4 Mac Mini is kind of a hybrid. It's got the power of a desktop, but is small enough to throw into a travel bag if you need to. Pair it with a portable mouse and keyboard, and you could even hook it up to a hotel TV for a really solid remote work setup. Honestly, I've seen some pretty wild examples of people packing a Mac Mini with a Vision Pro for a really cool, if pretty extravagant portable workstation. Now, back in the day, you'd always opt for a desktop if you wanted more power, but ever since Apple switched to their own silicon, that's not really the case anymore. Laptops are kind of the best of both worlds now. So why doesn't everyone just grab a laptop? Well, usually it comes down to price. A laptop is more expensive compared to a desktop, and that's because you're paying for all the extras: the screen, the keyboard, trackpad, battery, and all the engineering to make it portable. If you know for sure that you're going to be at your desk 100% of the time, a desktop is going to give you more bang for your buck. But if there's even the slightest chance that you'll want to take your computer somewhere, even just to another room in your house, I would definitely recommend going for a laptop. The good news is that the days of desktops being way more powerful than laptops are long gone. You can get some seriously impressive laptops from Apple now. You just have to be ready to pay a bit more for that convenience. Okay, let's start by looking at Apple's current lineup of laptops. Right now, there are two main options: the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro. Although don't let the Pro name fool you, the MacBook Air is still a very powerful computer and can handle a lot of professional tasks just fine. The current MacBook Air runs on the M3 chip, which it's worth pointing out is 1 generation old. Apple's in the process of transitioning all their Macs to the new M4 chip, and it is likely that the MacBook Air will get that upgrade sometime in early to mid 2025. But even with the M3 chip, the current MacBook Air is still a fantastic machine, especially for the more casual user who wants to do a bit of photo or 4K video editing on the side. And if you're looking for a bargain, you can still find the M2 MacBook Air for around $1,000. It's identical to the M3, except for the chip. And honestly, it's an amazing deal for what you get. I actually own an M2 MacBook Air myself, and while it's not my daily driver, I use it once or twice a week for lighter tasks like emails or writing scripts, and it's never felt underpowered for that kind of work. Plus, with Apple now including 16 gigabytes of memory as standard across the Mac lineup, even the base model M2 MacBook Air is a great value for $1,000. So how do you decide between the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro? Well, there are a few key differences. The MacBook Air is essentially a slimmer, lighter version of the MacBook Pro. The Pro does have a better screen, but that's something that you'll probably want to check out in person to see if it actually matters to you. The MacBook Pro's display gets much brighter and uses more advanced tech for richer colors, deeper blacks, and overall better visuals. This does make it a better choice if you're doing serious photo or video work. But the MacBook Air's screen is still very good for most people. Another difference is ProMotion. The MacBook Pro has a 120Hz refresh rate, which makes animations look super smooth compared to the 60Hz on the MacBook Air. If you haven't used a laptop with ProMotion before, it's probably not something that you'll miss, but it's a nice touch if you want that extra smoothness. There are also differences in connectivity. The MacBook Pro comes with 3 Thunderbolt ports, while the MacBook Air has 2. The Pro also has an SD card reader, an HDMI port built in, while the Air will need a dongle for those, which also uses up one of those Thunderbolt ports, and if you forget to bring it with you, you could be in trouble. If you're someone who regularly needs to swap out SD cards or connect to an external monitor, that is definitely worth considering. For most people though, the MacBook Air is going to be more than enough, especially if you value portability and want to save a bit of money. All right, so let's say that you've decided to go for the MacBook Air. Which configuration do you pick? Personally, if you can swing it, I'd recommend avoiding the base model. It's an extra $200, but it is worth it, mainly because the base model only comes with a 256GB SSD, which is a bit tight these days. That SSD is where all your files, apps, and everything else is stored. If it fills up, it can really slow things down. Yes, you could get an external SSD for more space, but if you're planning on downloading a lot of big apps, you'll end up filling that internal storage much faster than you might think. Also, modern Macs use something called swap memory. Basically, if you max out your 16GB of unified memory, the computer can use some of the SSD as extra memory. But for this to work, you need enough free space on the SSD. So a small SSD can actually impact your overall performance in ways that you might not expect. And remember, most of us buy a computer expecting to keep it for a few years. Even if 256GB is fine today, what about in 3 or 4 years? You might end up replacing it sooner than you'd planned. So if you can, I would suggest going for the mid-range version with a 512GB SSD and 2 extra GPU cores. If you're not sure what GPU cores are all about, don't worry, I will be covering that in the next section. One last thing, as I mentioned earlier, I do think Apple will refresh the MacBook Air with the M4 chip early next year. So if future-proofing your purchase is a priority, you might want to wait and see what Apple comes out with. Otherwise, you could end up with a computer that feels outdated a lot sooner than you thought. So I'm pretty clued up on Macs, that's why I've made this buyer's guide video. But when it comes to gifts for other people, that's definitely not my area of expertise. Thankfully, I've started using Perplexity, who are sponsoring this video. Perplexity is an answer engine that searches the internet in real time to give you fast, clear answers explained in everyday language that's easy to understand, with sources and citations. And it's amazing at shopping. So my wife, for example, she's always cold. And I remember seeing some kind of wearable hot water bottle on Instagram a few months ago. I can just open Perplexity and say, I'm looking for a wearable hot water bottle that goes over your shoulder. And not only does it give me useful information about the product in general, it gives me shopping links that I can use to immediately buy what I'm looking for. I can even use it for myself. So the other day, I asked it to help me find an external SSD with 2TB of storage, small enough to fit in my pocket, and it gave me some great suggestions. It tells you the key features of each product in the product card, so you can narrow down quickly to the one that's right for you, all from within the search results. So if a bit of help with your gift shopping this holiday season sounds good to you, check out Perplexity via the QR code on screen or via the link in the description of this video. Okay, let's talk about the MacBook Pro, but before we do that, let's take a quick moment to go over Apple's silicon. You might have noticed that when we talk about Macs, we mention different chips, the M2, the M3, and now the M4. These chips are what we call system on chips, meaning all the major components that make a computer work are combined into a single chip. You get the CPU, which handles most of the heavy lifting, and the GPU, which handles all of the graphics. The GPU powers your display and takes care of rendering graphics, especially important if you're into 3D modeling or video editing. These chips also include other elements like unified memory, all packed into one efficient unit. Now, why does this matter for the MacBook Pro? Well, because there are different versions of the M4 chip. You've got the base M4, the M4 Pro, and the M4 Max, each one more powerful and more expensive than the last. The more cores a chip has, the more powerful it is. But it's not that simple on the CPU side because there are different types of cores. Efficiency cores, which handle lighter tasks like emails or web browsing, and performance cores, which are for more intensive tasks. So the base M4 chip has 10 CPU cores, with 4 being performance cores and 6 being efficiency cores. It is designed to handle day-to-day tasks easily, whilst also giving you some power for occasional heavier workloads. The M4 Pro takes it up a notch with 14 cores, 10 of which are performance cores, making it much better suited for more demanding CPU tasks. The M4 Max goes even further, offering up to 16 cores, with 12 being performance cores. This chip is meant for pro users who need maximum performance. Generally, if you're the kind of person who needs a Max chip, you probably already know it. If your work involves 3D modeling, video editing, or anything where extra performance is going to pay off, the M4 Max is probably worth it, especially if it's how you make a living. It's an investment. But for most people, the decision is really between the base M4 and the M4 Pro, depending on how much extra power you think you'll need. Apple makes this choice easier with some guidance on their site. They explain that the M4 can easily handle multiple apps, thousands of photos, and even 4K video editing. So while you might think that you need a Pro version for more intense workloads, the base M4 is actually pretty powerful. The M4 Pro, on the other hand, is aimed at users who need to handle gigapixel panoramas, compile massive amounts of code, or edit multiple streams of 8K video. If that doesn't sound like your kind of work, you're probably better off saving your money and going with the base M4. You could even use the savings to upgrade other specs, like the memory, which can make a big difference. Speaking of memory, the base model M4 comes with 16 gigabytes of unified memory, but you might want to upgrade to 24 gigabytes if you can afford it. It isn't cheap. Apple charges $200 for every 8 gigabytes. But remember, you can't upgrade later, so it is worth thinking about now. For instance, a $2,000 M4 MacBook Pro with 24 gigabytes of memory and a 1 terabyte SSD might be a better investment than a more expensive M4 Pro with less storage. As for whether it's a good time to buy a MacBook Pro, the lineup has just been updated with the M4 chip, and no major redesigns are expected until at least 2026. The next refresh will likely be the M5 chip around this time next year, which should bring only incremental improvements. So if you're thinking of buying now, it is definitely a safe choice. All right, with laptops covered, let's talk about desktops for a bit. Apple offers 4 desktop options, 3 of which are essentially boxes that sit on or under your desk and need a separate mouse, keyboard, and monitor. The 4th is the iMac, which is an all-in-one computer. First off, let's just skip over one of those entirely, the Mac Pro. Also known as the cheese grater Mac, this machine has been around since 2019 and got an Apple Silicon update just last year. The Mac Pro really only exists today because it supports PCI-compatible devices internally. When you open it up, there are 6 full-length PCI Express Gen 4 slots, which can be used for things like networking cards or audio interface cards, the kind of specialized hardware that some professionals need. If that doesn't sound like something you need, then the Mac Pro is just an overly expensive machine that isn't for you. So for most people, it is safe to just disregard it. If you're enjoying the content here, why not sign up for my weekly newsletter, which is all about tech news and tips delivered free to your inbox each Friday. Sign up via the QR code on screen or the link in the description. If you're after a pro-level desktop, the Mac Studio is where you want to look. It packs all the power of the Mac Pro into a compact box that sits on your desk. There is a lot to like about the Mac Studio. In my opinion, it is the best Mac for demanding users, and it even beats the M4 Max MacBook Pro in many tasks or comes really close in others. Plus, it has the best thermal system of any Mac. I've had an M2 Ultra Mac Studio for over a year, and I've never heard the fans kick in, no matter how hard I push it. Tasks that make my M3 Max MacBook Pro sound like a jet engine taking off are completely silent on the Mac Studio. The connectivity is also great. You get 4 Thunderbolt ports on the back, plus 2 USB-C ports on the front if you go for the Max chip. Those front ports are also Thunderbolt if you go for the Ultra chip. You also get 2 regular USB ports, HDMI out, an Ethernet port, and a card reader. Basically, it has enough ports that you probably won't need any extra docks or hubs, even if you're a demanding user. When it comes to chips, you have 2 options, the M2 Max or the M2 Ultra. It is worth mentioning that the Mac Studio is still on the M2 generation of chips. The M2 Ultra is basically 2 M2 Max chips fused together, so you get double everything. For example, the M2 Max has a 12-core CPU, while the M2 Ultra has a 24-core CPU. The GPU cores also double, 30 for the M2 Max, 60 for the M2 Ultra. The neural engine, which handles AI tasks, also doubles, 16 cores in the M2 Max, 32 cores in the M2 Ultra. Of course, all that power comes at a price. The M2 Max Mac Studio starts at $2,000, while the M2 Ultra version starts at $4,000. So you need to decide if that level of power is really what you need. I personally own the M2 Ultra Mac Studio and I love it, but I will admit it is overkill for what I do. It can handle up to 22 streams of 8K ProRes video, perform 31.6 trillion operations a second, and support up to 8 external displays. It's a beast, and I bought it mainly because I wanted the best computer available at the time. But for most people, it is probably more than necessary, unless you really know that you need that level of power. That said, I also wouldn't necessarily recommend the M2 Max Mac Studio right now. The M2 chip is 2 generations old, and the Mac Studio is expected to be upgraded to M4 chips, likely an M4 Max and an M4 Ultra sometime next summer. So you could end up spending a lot of money on a desktop that becomes outdated pretty quickly. Honestly, for the price, an M4 Pro MacBook Pro might be better value for most people. In terms of configurations, I reckon the base model for both computers should be enough for most users. The M2 Ultra comes with a 1TB SSD and 64GB of unified memory right out of the box. So unless you really feel that you need to squeeze more power or storage out of the computer, I would just stick with that. So that leaves us with the more consumer-focused desktop devices. Let's start with the iMac, which is the only all-in-one Mac, meaning that you don't need to add a display, mouse, or keyboard because everything that you need comes in the box. It also just got a speed boost thanks to the M4 chip replacing the older M2. This upgrade brings a really nice performance bump to the iMac lineup. It's important to note that the iMac is not aimed at professionals. Apple's marketing shows it being used by kids in the kitchen, families FaceTiming grandparents, or as a recipe screen while cooking. That doesn't mean that it can't do some pro-level work. Remember, the M4 chip can handle 4K video editing, but it's essentially the same chip found in the iPad Pro, now in an iMac body. So keep that in mind. The iMac is all about convenience, ease of use, and personalization with a range of bright colors to choose from. What you are getting is a very capable and well-rounded computer. The iMac screen is excellent, the webcam is great for most people, and the speakers sound fantastic. You're getting an all-in-one Mac experience without having to break the bank, which is why the iMac remains so popular. For most people that want a desktop Mac, the iMac is definitely the best fit. When it comes to which variation to buy, things do get a little confusing. The iMac with the M4 chip is only available with the M4. There's no option for an M4 Pro. So your main options are about memory and storage. The base model iMac comes with 16GB of unified memory, which should be enough for most users, but it only has 256GB of storage, which probably isn't enough. As we mentioned earlier, running out of storage can negatively impact performance, so it is worth considering an upgrade. You could get the base model and configure it at checkout to bump the storage to 512GB, which brings the price from $12.99 to $14.99. There's also a mid-range iMac at $14.99, which still has only 256GB of storage, but it comes with a 10-core CPU and a 10-core GPU compared to the 8-core CPU and GPU in the base model. So you're getting a bit more power, but you need to decide if it's worth it for your use. If you're mostly browsing the web, editing documents, or handling emails, spending $200 for 2 extra CPU and GPU cores probably doesn't make sense. The base model can still handle 4K video editing, it just won't be as fast as the mid-range. So in my opinion, the $200 would be better spent on upgrading storage instead. The mid-range iMac does give you 2 additional Thunderbolt ports compared to the base model, which has 2 Thunderbolt ports and 2 regular USB-C ports, plus Gigabit Ethernet. There are also higher-end configurations. For $16.99, you can get 512GB of SSD storage, and for $18.99, you get that plus 24GB of memory. So what would I do personally? I'd probably go with the base model, either as is or with a few upgrades. Most iMac users don't need the extra CPU and GPU power based on how I think they'll be using their computers. If you know that you'll only be installing a few apps and using it mainly for light daily tasks, the base model should be enough and you can save your money. If you want to future-proof a bit, spending $400 to upgrade to 512GB of storage and 24GB of memory is a better investment than opting for the mid-range model with slightly more CPU and GPU power but less storage. So that just leaves the Mac Mini. This is definitely one of the most exciting Macs available right now, and not just because it's the smallest. Apple has done something pretty incredible here in terms of packing so much power into such a tiny computer. The Mac Mini is essentially a smaller version of the Mac Studio. It sits in size between an Apple TV 4K box, which is smaller, and the Mac Studio, which is quite a bit bigger. The connectivity is excellent, with ports on both the front and back. You get the option of either an M4 chip or an M4 Pro chip, which makes this Mac aimed at both the consumer market, people looking for an affordable entry into the Apple ecosystem, and the more professional market, for those who need serious performance without the price tag of a Mac Studio. Essentially, it gives you the power of the M4 chip, the same thermal system as the Mac Studio, and similar connectivity, all in a much smaller box. It is a fantastic little computer. In terms of configurations, the base model is really affordable, making it the cheapest way to get into the Mac ecosystem. The base M4 Mac Mini starts at just $599. If you already have a monitor, keyboard, and mouse, this is an incredibly inexpensive way to get into the Mac ecosystem and benefit from features like Apple Intelligence, all without breaking the bank. It's a great value. That said, like with some other configurations we've discussed, the base storage is a bit disappointing. Apple only includes 256 gigabytes of SSD storage, which might not be enough for many users. So if you can afford it, I think it's worth future-proofing a bit and opting for the next model up, which gives you 512 gigabytes of storage. It's essentially the same as the base model, but with double the storage, and it costs $200 more. It's also worth noting that the M4 chip used here is the full version with a 10-core CPU and a 10-core GPU. None of the Mac mini models come with the 8-core version, so you're getting plenty of power for the price. In that respect, the extra $200 for more storage is definitely a smart investment. If you're thinking of going all in, there's also the M4 Pro version. If you plan on using the Mac mini for work or generating an income, the M4 Pro model is a solid choice. Not only does it come with a 512 gigabyte SSD as standard, but it also has 24 gigabytes of unified memory and the more powerful M4 Pro chip, which features a 12-core CPU and a 16-core GPU. But it is significantly more expensive, starting at $1399. But for those who need the extra performance, could be worth the investment. Okay, before I close the video, I want to quickly mention Apple Certified Refurbished. If you're not familiar with it, every time someone returns a computer or trades one into Apple, that device gets refurbished by Apple and sold as a certified refurbished product. When you buy a certified refurbished device from Apple, it comes in plain packaging, not as glossy or as exciting as buying something brand new. But when you take the device out, it is essentially indistinguishable from a brand new one. It still comes with an Apple warranty, and you're getting all the performance of a brand new Mac, just at a slightly lower price. It is definitely worth checking out. The Apple Certified Refurbished store works in real time. What you see is what they have in stock at that moment. You can't order specific items like you can when buying new, so availability can vary. Sometimes they'll have an influx of certain products, and other times they might be out of stock. For example, while researching for this video, I found several M2 Ultra Mac Studios for $3,399, which is a $600 saving compared to buying new. If you need an M2 Ultra Mac Studio today, and you don't mind that it might get refreshed next year, you could save some money and still get an incredibly powerful machine at a discount. So, in closing the video, there are two things that I want to remind you about. The first relates to a common question that I always get whenever I talk about new iPhones, iPads, or Macs. Do I buy this now or wait for the next one? The temptation is to always hold out. Apple keeps updating their devices, and Macs are now almost on an annual refresh cycle similar to the iPhone. That could change. There's talk of Apple adjusting the time between the product refreshes. But if we assume that there will be a new version of each Mac every 12 to 18 months, you have to accept that any computer that you buy today will technically be outdated within that time frame. For instance, I currently own 4 Macs, an M2 MacBook Air, an M2 Max MacBook Pro, an M3 Max MacBook Pro, and an M2 Ultra Mac Studio. So technically, none of the Macs that I use daily are current generation models. They're all at least one chip generation behind. But honestly, I've got no desire to upgrade any of them. My M3 Max MacBook Pro is more than powerful enough for everything that I do daily, and it's portable. The M2 Ultra Mac Studio is an absolute beast. Computers are tools to get things done, and my advice is always to buy what you need today with a long-term perspective. If a refresh is right around the corner, it might be worth waiting, but otherwise, don't overthink it. At the moment, we know an M4 MacBook Air is expected early next year, and an M4 Max Mac Studio should follow around the middle of the year. So if those specific models are what you're holding out for, it could be worth waiting. But for the rest of the lineup, I'd say it's a good time to buy without worrying about being outdated soon. The second thing I want to mention is that while Apple Silicon has brought some amazing advancements, it has also limited your ability to upgrade your Mac later on. The SSD you buy today is the SSD you'll have for the life of the computer. The memory you buy today is what you're stuck with. Yes, you can add external SSDs for extra storage, but that's not the same as upgrading internal components. The point I'm making is make your buying decisions with some future-proofing in mind. If you can stretch your budget a little, I recommend prioritizing SSD upgrades. In my opinion, that's more crucial than bumping up the unified memory, especially considering Apple's high prices for memory upgrades. I think 16 gigabytes of memory is enough for most users, and I'd personally focus on upgrading the SSD first. So there you go, that's the current Mac lineup and my recommendations for what you should be buying. What do you think? Are you looking at buying a new Mac computer? If yes, what are you thinking of getting? Or are you going to wait and see what comes next year? Drop me a comment and let me know. And as ever, if you found this video useful, do please consider leaving me a like and subscribing to my channel for more content like this in the future. See you on the next video.